And Pete Carroll is tremendous at getting teams to play well defensively. As Seattle ranks number 4 in the NFL in that category. They are just a tremendous team. And you look at that NFC, that conference, right now they're in the mix for the wild card spot. And we'll get to this later, but let's not mark off the Seattle Seahawks as a divisional winner or loser, because the San Francisco 49ers, this isn't the first time. They've gotten the wheels spun off the tracks. Now, they were lucky to even tie this game against the Rams. But for Seattle, after a big-time win, the NFC West is seemingly wide open with these two teams, as they do indeed face later on in the year. And also, reading off the Seattle easy schedule down the stretch, after a Week 11 bye, they have to face the Dolphins in their house, a big-time chance for a win. And then they also have to face the Bears. That one could go either way with Jay Cutler's injury concerns in question. Then they're home to face the Cardinals. Then they're on the way to face the Bills. And in perhaps the marquee game in this division, Week 16, they are home against the Niners. We all know how Seattle plays at home. Then they're also home against the St. Louis Rams in Week 17. This could be a 10-win football team, and barring a win against the Niners, this team could be a division champion in an NFC West that is wide open.
Yeah, I think another thing that makes this really interesting is we touched on a little bit before is the Niners and Rams tying this past week. So it doesn't really count for a win, doesn't really count for a loss, but record-wise, it could definitely be that quick loophole needed for Seattle to possibly jump in there. You look at the schedule, like you said, just beating the teams they should beat. Here's a team that could easily have 10 wins at the end of the year. So it really depends what happens with the Niners the rest of the year, and if that tie, does come back to haunt them in the end.
And they seemingly have a quarterback that can win and a receiver to throw, a receiver that can throw as good as half the teams in this league. Golden Tate with a nice touchdown throw on that play where the Seahawks win by the final 28-7. And moving on to that NFC West game where a tie doesn't seemingly help the Niners in any way. And in a sense, they're still a half game in front of the Packers at 6-3 at this point. But for the Niners in this ball game, where they were completely outplayed, where the Rams almost in a 2-to-1 ratio outgained them in yards and also in the passing game, Sam Bradford showed Alex Smith and Colin Kaepernick up in this entire football game. In San Francisco, the Niners could not defeat the St. Louis Rams, and even though it's a tie, things are falling off the tracks for San Francisco. And I mentioned they're not an easy divisional win. Would you agree that San Francisco, despite having 6 wins to 2 losses and a tie, are they still the favorite in that NFC West?
I would have to say they're still the favorite just because of what they accomplished last year. And, going up against Seattle, I think they'd still be favored, just matchup-wise. I think, Russell Wilson against this defense, you never know what could happen. He's rose to the occasion before. He's also crumbled under some pressure at times. So I think you still got to give him the favorite just because of the way they match up against, Seattle. They're a big-time run team with Marshawn Lynch in there. But, the Niners very good against the run. So I think because of the way they match up against Seattle, they're still the favorite in that division.
San Francisco still leading that NFC West, and if the playoffs were to start today, the San Francisco 49ers would be in the playoffs as the number 3 seed, and they would bump the Green Bay Packers into the number 5 seed, as they do indeed have a 6-2-1 record. Another team in that NFC that is reckoning with some big-time teams in that conference for making a way into the playoffs is the Minnesota Vikings at 6-4. Record-wise, they indeed would miss the playoffs. Just by record-wise, so far in the NFC, if the playoffs were to start today, the Seahawks have the matchup edge over the Minnesota Vikings. But one thing I mentioned right before the top is that the Minnesota Vikings have perhaps the most tough schedule in the entire NFL down the stretch, as let's just read off this brutal list. Now, they do have a bye, but then they have to go to Chicago to face the Bears. then have to go to Green Bay to face the Packers, two tough roadies. Then they're home against the Bears again, and then they have to travel back to St. Louis to take on a team that almost beat the San Francisco 49ers, really should have. Then they travel to Houston to take on the Texans, and then they're home to take on the Packers again. This could be a team that only wins one game down the stretch, if any. Now, Christian Ponder is paid as well as any quarterback in his second year, but at 6-4, still third in the NFC North and not even in the wild card contention. This could be a trap game, and the Minnesota Vikings, I see, are pretenders more than contenders in that conference.
Well, I think the thing that makes it different with the Vikings, I remember our first couple episodes of this show, there's a lot of people that had them pegged to be the worst team in football and have the number one pick in the draft. So at this point, anything they do, here's a team I think realistically is supposed to have 4 or 5 wins at the end of the year. Nobody expected them to even be in any kind of conversation. So the fact they are, is kudos to them. They've strung a couple good games together. Christian Ponder playing pretty well at times. Here's a team, I don't think anyone ever put a lot of stock into their playoff hopes. Obviously, right off that schedule, it's pretty brutal. I think by the end of the year, it'll be them and Detroit, just trying not to be in last place in that division at year's end. I think Detroit will have the slight edge when it comes to that.
Well, interestingly enough, if the Minnesota Vikings beat the Packers in that game in week number 13, they would seemingly, if the playoffs were to start at that point, they would have the edge over the Packers. But just coming down the stretch, a brutal final 7 games for the Minnesota Vikings. 6-4 currently, but in a very under-talented team. They're just, in my mind, they're the beneficiaries of what is a very easy first half of the schedule. And I don't see this team being a winning football team. 8-8 might be their destiny, and I don't even think that they're a team that can post up 8 wins. But things have been very good for the Minnesota Vikings, and if they don't indeed beat these teams, Adrian Peterson might be completely out of the MVP race as well, as he has the most yards of any running back in the NFL. And just a quick nugget here as well. Phil, who do you believe is the MVP? Does Adrian Peterson have a chance, or is it still a race between Robert Griffin and Andrew Luck?
Well, it's hard. Some people look at, just the individual's performance. But the truth of the matter is a lot of people look at the individual performance plus the success of the team. So, you look at that, it would all depend on how the Vikings go, because a lot of these are based off of that. You don't see guys win MVPs or, sometimes Rookie of the Year, but mostly, MVP type awards, on teams with sub 500 records, regardless of how good they play. Because no matter how good you play, there's always a guy that plays, somewhat towards your level, but that team is in the playoffs. So it definitely helps that scenario for whoever that person may be. I think Adrian Peterson's opportunities to win MVP are behind him. I think, not necessarily to say that his play is diminished, but, I think the better teams that he'll be on in his career, as long as he's with the Vikings, that is, were in the days of Brett Favre. So I think it'd be very difficult for someone like him to gain MVP with this team around him.
And certainly, if the Vikings don't win more than one game this remaining stretch, he is seemingly out of that race. That's already favored towards Robert Griffin and Andrew Luck. But speaking of tremendous players, we'll head over to our Facebook question of the week. Phil Nunziata posted it just a few days ago. Who is the best player to never win a Super Bowl? We'll have our final results at the end of the show, and seemingly this is a race that could go on. A debate that really is never ending. But we have some big time results as far as the best player to never win a Super Bowl. Hank Cinnamon of Facebook messaging that Dan Marino is the best player to never win a Super Bowl. He never even made it. Barry Sanders also as well. Phil, you thought Chris Carter was the man, and I think I would agree with that one. But Deacon Jones was a tremendous player as well. And Jordan Begornia chiming in that LaDainian Tomlinson is the best player to never win a Super Bowl. Lawrence Boehm goes with Thurman Thomas, and Sean Kramer goes with Dick Butkus, linebacker for Chicago back in the 60s. Now, certainly, this is a topic that could never end as far as the best NFL player to not win a Super Bowl. But so far in the NFL today, and seemingly this is the case for a number of teams, but just these young rookie quarterbacks trying to get into the glory of winning a Super Bowl, Andrew Luck and Robert Griffin, neither one of these teams really set for a playoff or for a Super Bowl berth, at least this year. But the game that no one talks about because it's a Thursday night game, Andrew Luck really demolished the Jacksonville Jaguars in their own house, 27-10 your final. The Colts can really make some hay in that conference that already is weak to begin with. 6-3, a tremendous start. Is Indianapolis contenders or pretenders, Phil? A great start so far.
Well, I don't know how much stock you can put into a win against Jacksonville. I live in Florida. I've been to a few of those games, once when they played the Eagles and a few others just to go to the game. Not a very intimidating atmosphere at all. So it's not really a hard place to go in there and win, But regardless of that, Andrew Luck played very well, 2 rushing touchdowns on the day. This is a team, looking really, really good in a, their division seems to be locked up by Houston. I don't know if locked up is the word, but they have a pretty good control over it. So I think if this team's going to make the playoffs, it's going to be a wild card route. So it's a team, similar to the Seattle thing, I would say. They're beating the teams that they should, and then they're even getting 1 or 2 upsets along the way. So this is another team that, by the end of the year is at least going to be in the conversation for the playoffs.
And if the playoffs were indeed to end today, Indianapolis would be the number 5 seed. And just rounding out the entire AFC, the Texans, meanwhile, upsetting the Chicago Bears in Chicago. We'll get to that game in just a second. 8-1, they have the first seed, and they're a game up in front of the Baltimore Ravens at 7-2. Texans control their destiny. Who knows if they're the best team in that conference? Right now, it seems to be the case. But rounding out the divisional winners, another team that can make some hay is the Denver Broncos. And seemingly also, even if the Pittsburgh Steelers lose this game, they're still on their way to the playoffs, at least from today's record. They're 5-3 currently. The New England Patriots are division winners right now. They have the number 3 seed if the playoffs were to start today. And speaking of the Houston Texans, real quick over to Houston's side, and seemingly this is the debate every week, even though they're not undefeated, same record as the NFC record-leading Atlanta Falcons. 8-1 right now. Houston, another big-time win. Schaub not even 100 yards offensively. Is Houston the best team in the AFC with teams like Denver and Pittsburgh really rallying as of late? They don't have the record as Houston, but they're playing as well as the Texans are.
Yeah, the Texans started off, red hot, and it was almost a unanimous decision that this is a team that was, number 1. Teams like this, if they're going to start off hot, they're going to hit that point in the year where they run out of steam, at least for a while. And, the difference between good teams and great teams is those great teams get those second wins, in the playoffs, right before it starts or whatever it takes to get in there. So really, this team, I think it's hit the wall as a team that, historically has not had a lot of success. So they've hit the wall possibly as far as offensive production. That being said, their defense is picking up the slack as they beat Chicago with Jay Cutler being out of the game. But it's a team that, it's interesting to see how they will respond to the second half of the year.
And Houston, at least in this game, showing that they can win in all different assets of, playing a game. One time it's offensively putting up a 40-burger. And in this game, they only give up 6 points. They only need 13 to rack up a W. And the defense also with 3 turnovers forced in this game. Cutler throwing 2 picks and then a fumble by Michael Bush. 3 turnovers forced as well. So Houston right now at 8-1, controlling their own destiny with an easy division as well. Their only tough competitor is the Indianapolis Colts they have to play later on in the year. Houston, one of the top teams in the NFL, but one team right up there, the Denver Broncos, another huge win over the Panthers. Is this team set for a big-time run? They have an easy schedule to close out, including the Chargers again. Might I mention also a team falling off the tracks as well. Is Denver set for a second or a third seed